All right, let's talk about physical security at the individual level. Now, we've heard about VPN all day long, but the threat here when it comes to the individual level is actual data and files on an individual computer. And with so many people who work with software and software engineers working from home, working from co-working spaces, or generally carrying around the computer, you have to think about things like this. So even before we get into the shared team environment for software, it starts with the Engineer Workstation, because the Engineer Workstation has the Git repository on your computer. It has the source code and it has some data. Now, there are practices that we have talked about a lot when it comes to cloning and masking and making sure that none of the data sets that the software engineers use have actual production sensitive data. And there are techniques to make sure that you do not have any sensitive data when going from a production backup in the cases that you have to do that temporarily, but more importantly, being able to generate sets of data from an automated perspective so that the source of the data that we work with never came from real data in the first place. But sometimes when you're debugging a performance issue and you really need the shape of the data in production, it's common and sometimes necessary to have an environment where you do some sort of backup restore from a production database, but make sure that you have masked or gotten rid of the sensitive data columns in that particular database while still being able to do some type of performance debugging. And so whether it's that or whether it's just having documents, OneDrive, Google Drive, Dropbox, it synchronizes data files onto the computer. And so there's network sniffers, but if your computer is mobile and someone's carrying it around in a backpack, it can be lost. So when it's lost, the question is, have we actually put in place some security controls to make sure that the data on that computer cannot be compromised? So that's where using Active Directory, Microsoft 360 logins, and BitLocker come in. And some of you might be saying, oh, these are just the basics. These are just the tickets to the game. Okay, that may be so. But how many of us have used maybe some contractors on a particular project where that contractor, we needed to give them access to Dropbox or OneDrive, or we needed to email them some stuff, or obviously we needed to give them access to the Git repository. So corporately, we may have those controls, but what about the contractors that have the same amount of data? Okay, we need to think about that. So that's one point. Now, at home, think about the networks that we're using. Now, it's fine to use regular home DSL, cable modem, internet connection, but just like when thinking about Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, SOC 2, PCI compliance, when designing the architecture of a software system that's handling financial or healthcare information, the same themes come up. And that is, how is data moving between computers and how is data sitting in a storage state at rest? And always the same two things. Encryption. Is data encrypted at rest? And is data encrypted in transit? And so we work those into the architecture of the software systems, because in those spaces, it's normal for the software system itself to be audited. If you're doing financial transactions or healthcare or even FERPA with software that deals with student information, K through 12, college, but all the same audits tend to be themed in a similar way. Do you have existing controls to mitigate threats? And one of the most common controls is encryption in transit, encryption at rest. And so VPN gives us that encryption in transit. BitLocker gives us encryption at rest. But at the same time, if other traffic of the computer is going across a network where other devices can just constantly try to pick and port scan, that's one thing we need to think about as well. So we need to intentionally just do a little bit of inspection on the networks that our individual team members are using. And most routers that they already have either support a separate network or at a minimum creating a VLAN so that it becomes impossible for a compromised device on their network to just sit there all day port scanning or attempting to find some sort of vulnerability in their workstation. So that's another good recommendation for you. And then the last point on physical security is recognize that your passwords are compromised. Unless you've already done this and have done it probably a few times, I guarantee you that if you go onto any of the online password checkers or the one built into Edge, one's built into Chrome, and just look for compromised passwords, you will find reports where literally your username and password that you used on some particular service was lost in a data breach. Okay, now it could have been you bought a movie ticket on fandango.com and you gave it your email address and some password that you didn't use with anyone else. Okay, well, that's good. Now, chances are a lot of people, they might have used a password that they did use with another service. Well, whether or not that's true, they now have your email address that you use for online accounts. Now, how many people use the same email address for accounts with multiple service providers? And because that's true, well, now they have a list of accounts at all kinds of service providers to just check and see if they can do brute force attacks, dictionary attacks, use all of your other passwords to see if you reused one. So be aware that your passwords have leaked, every single one of us. And it's really important to use a password manager. I currently use LastPass for personal, and then we have enterprise level LastPass as well that allows the temporary sharing of credentials and also schedules to rotate credentials. But it makes it super accessible, but it also effectively gives me a unique, long gobbledygook password that I would never remember in the first place for every different account. And then finally, because we're using so much on our phone, really look for the tampering of your phone. It is possible, and there's been plenty of reports of tampering and cloning of a SIM card so that two-factor authentication SMS messages get sent to somebody else in addition to you. And so you definitely look for evidence that your SIM card has been taken out and put back in, and you can add tamper detection, like putting a piece of tape at a minimum over that little SIM card slot. And of course, on all of your accounts, two-factor authentication helps a whole lot. It's something plus something you have. That's kind of the theory of two-factor authentication.